All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris. So as this quote from Paul Taylor, the Executive Vice President of the Pew Center, connotes, there's more change underway in American families right now than at any time since the 1960s. And the implications for businesses are huge. So that makes me particularly excited today to have the opportunity to share these new data and insights with you. To put it as succinctly as possible, families are becoming much more diverse in their structures, and they're also changing qualitatively. For example, with fewer formal marriage ties, as well as people playing different roles within the family. As these trends mature, successful companies may turn out to be those that adopt almost a long-tail approach that recognizes the huge variety that's emerging. So I'm going to dive into talking about the new family types. In the past couple of years, several new treasure troves of research have come out that contain really incredible revelations about all the changes underway in families. The main one, of course, is the 2010 census, which was full of interesting surprises. Another is from the Pew Research Center, which has done some terrific work cross-cutting the census data with their own surveys about Americans' attitudes toward all the changes that are underway. So collectively, all this new information is great news for consumer-focused companies, since it provides a wealth of insight into how your family target segments are changing. The central point is that the classic Leave It to Beaver nuclear family of, married couple with kids and a gerbil now equals less than a fifth of U.S. households. In its place, Pew has identified strong ongoing increases in 7 non-traditional family structures. Today, we're going to focus on just 5 of these, which we at Innovaro feel are the freshest and the most interesting for companies. But all 7 of the new types are covered in a global lifestyles brief, which is called GL 2011-8, The Rise of New Family Types in the U.S. So please be sure to check that out for more detail. Here we go, into the 5 family types. First, we're going to talk about unmarried motherhood, which has been totally escalating. In 2008, a whopping 41% of all U.S. births were to unmarried women. By contrast, in 1960, only 5% were. These unmarried mothers fall into 2 broad categories, single moms who have children but no significant other, and unmarried women who do have a partner, and these are typically referred to in the literature as cohabiting parents. These 2 groups of mothers are important to distinguish because they typically have very different lifestyles and attitudes and reasons for having kids. Let me talk first briefly about single moms. About 25% of American kids today are being raised in a single-parent household. This is up from about 21% in 1990. One way that single motherhood differs from the other emerging family types is that it still evokes disapproval across the board from Americans. Attitudes toward all the other emerging types have been softening. But in surveys, no matter what the gender, the generation, the race of the respondents, almost 70% of Americans think that single women having children without a male partner is bad for society. And unfortunately, the research does support this jaundiced view and tends to show that children who grow up without 2 parents in the home do face a number of special challenges. Then, as I mentioned, the other kind of unmarried mothers are those who are cohabiting with a male partner. Census data has shown that most of the rise in children being born to unmarried women today is actually not from single mothers. It's from women like these who are in their 20s and 30s and are cohabiting but not married. So if around 40% of all U.S. births were to unmarried women in 2008, 40% of those unmarried mothers are in these kinds of live-in relationships. So this is a big and interesting new phenomenon, and one question it raises is whether these women are rejecting marriage or just delaying it. Well, apparently most of them are delaying. Among cohabitants with children, nearly 60% say that they do hope to marry someday. So it seems obvious that cohabitation, both with and without children, is emerging as a more normal and expected life stage along the path to marriage. And this is particularly true of millennials, and I expect Michael and Morley might have more to say about that later on. In terms of attitudes toward cohabiting parents, the vast majority of Americans, about 80%, are willing to call an unmarried couple with kids a family. And it's really the kids that sway this opinion. Only about half as many are willing to call a cohabiting couple without children a family. So given the trajectory of these trends, we do expect to see a continued rise in kids that are being raised by single moms and cohabiting couples. And over time, this should continue to erode stigmas associated with unmarried parenthood. All right, let's move on to the other types. Oops, sorry about that. Let me turn briefly to same-sex couples in marriage. The big news here is that the 2010 census was the first census ever to distinguish gay marriage from traditional marriage on the questionnaire. So what this means is that later this year, when Census releases that data, we're going to have the biggest, most authoritative data set that has yet been available for this population. While we're waiting for that, estimates are putting the number of same-sex couples living together in the U.S. at just under 600,000. And about 50 to 80,000 of these are married, that is, married under state law, and another 85,000 or so are in civil unions or registered domestic partnerships. And, by the way, it's been estimated that roughly 20% of same-sex households today are raising children, which means that around 250,000 U.S. children today are being raised by same-sex parents. You can imagine that the outcomes of same-sex parenting are going to be closely analyzed as more data becomes available. So that's another thing we'll learn a lot more about in the near future. Briefly on attitudes towards same-sex couples, as these households become more common, attitudes have been continuing to soften. In fact, recently, for the first time since Pew began asking people about this, fewer than half of U.S. adults now oppose same-sex marriage. And about two-thirds of Americans say that a gay or lesbian couple raising a child is a family. Still, it's important to note that the ratio of approval to disapproval is very close, including among millennials, who are the most tolerant group. So these close numbers make it clear that same-sex marriage will likely remain a divisive issue in the U.S. for many years to come, even as tolerance continues to rise. Let's talk briefly about childless women. Childlessness has been rising steadily. In 2008, 46% of women in the childbearing years were childless. And this trend spans all racial and ethnic groups, although white women are the most likely to have never had children. As you'd expect, for many women, childlessness is a phase. About 60% of those who are childless say they hope to have children someday. Nevertheless, it is definitely rising. The share of women in their 40s who have never had children has approximately doubled since 1980, now to about 18% of all women in their 40s, so that's obviously substantial. As far as attitudes go, Americans are very tolerant of childless women. Nearly 9 in 10 say that a childless married couple qualifies as a family in their view. And most also say that the trend toward rising childlessness makes little difference to society. Finally, we're going to talk about racially mixed couples. There are two big takeaways here. First, intermarriage among the races has been rising dramatically. In 2008, it reached a record 14.6% of all newlyweds, more than doubling from about 7% in 1980. So basically, 1 in 7 new U.S. marriages now are interracial or interethnic. The second big takeaway is that this trend breaks out strongly along racial and ethnic lines. Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans are marrying out, as it's called, at exceptionally high rates. In 2008, nearly 31% of Asian American newlyweds and 26% of Hispanic newlyweds married people of other races or ethnicities. Rates for blacks and whites were substantially lower, at just about 9% and 16% respectively. Where people are born also matters. Native-born Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans are much more likely to marry out than foreign-born ones. Attitudes toward intermarriage are very tolerant. Most Americans are just fine with it. All of this data suggests that over time, a growing share of Americans are going to be multiracial, as the increase in interracial marriages produces more multiracial children. Some experts project that by 2050, 20% of Americans will be multiracial. As an aside, as we close in our discussion of the new family types, you may have noticed that a common thread running through all this data about attitudes is the millennials. They're a highly tolerant generation, and in the oldest ones, this tolerance has persisted now through their 20s. So it might be a lifelong trait. So a safe forecast to make is that overall American attitudes toward new family types will continue to loosen as more millennials reach adulthood. I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Morley and Michael about millennial values.